The commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So the next day he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the members of the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, "My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. At this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. Then Paul said to him, 'God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck.' Those who were standing near Paul said, 'How dare you insult God's high priest?' Paul replied, 'Brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people.' Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others were Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, 'My brothers, I am a Pharisee, descended from Pharisees. I stand on trial because of the hope of the resurrection of the dead.' When he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say there is no resurrection, and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees believe all these things. There was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, stood up and argued vigorously. 'We find nothing wrong with this man,' they said. 'What if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him?' The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. The following night the Lord stood near Paul and said, 'Take courage. As you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so must you testify in Rome.'"
All right, thank you. All right, so, like I said, we'll pick up here. We use first. Okay. There in verse 30. So the next day, after he was almost flogged, the next day, since the commander wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews, he released him and ordered the chief priests and all the Sanhedrin to assemble. Then he brought Paul and had him stand before them. So, Reese notes here at this time, Luke says again that the commander is trying to find out what's exactly going on. And Reese says that this is really the third attempt. Well, there's been three separate attempts up to this point to try to figure out precisely why the Jews are so upset with Paul and why they want to condemn him to death. And he hasn't gotten an answer still, and this is what Luke talks about, that he wanted to find out exactly why Paul was being accused by the Jews. So there's been all this commotion, all of this hearsay, but this answer is still not come forth, or at least there's not been a very substantial answer to this question. And certainly he can't figure out why Paul is being targeted this way. And I mean, that just kind of points out how, I guess this is the first film blank already, but it kind of points out how Luke is emphasizing that there's really no good grounds for all of this to be going on in the first place. Like, if this is still going on, they're still trying to figure out why Paul is being accused of all these things accused of different things. It's just, like I said, in the mob, it's just some said one thing, some said another, and they couldn't really get at the bottom of it, to get to the bottom of it. But it's confusing, and there's really no valid point that they have. And that's the first fill in the blank there. But Luke's just reiterating that again here in verse 30. So Luke emphasized how the commander still did not know why the Jews wanted Paul dead. Luke emphasized how the commander still did not know why the Jews wanted Paul dead. But it does seem like the commander had some sort of authority to call together the Sanhedrin. I guess some scholars think that this is like an informal greeting, that he doesn't have the ultimate authority to do this, but it does seem like he has some power to be able to draw this meeting together. And they bring Paul, and he had him stand before them. Then, verse 1. Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said, My brothers, I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. So the text here, this language, communicates the intensity of the situation. That Luke is saying Paul looked straight at the Sanhedrin and said with this confidence, my brothers, he's recognizing them as his brothers, even though they don't like him. I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. Well, that's an interesting thing to say, right? Considering his past. And he is alluding to his whole life. I have fulfilled my duty to God in all good conscience to this day. So up until now, I am still in good conscience. And what we have to understand here that is kind of difficult in just reading the English is that in good conscience doesn't really mean precisely the way that we think of conscience today as like I feel my conscience is clear about all that stuff that I did just because it was all right. But it more communicates that even when Paul was like persecuting the Christians, and the text said it as well, that he was doing everything that he did for the service of God. What you would say was Yahweh, and then obviously now the Lord Jesus, same God, but it communicates more that he was still like, even when he was in the wrong in his conscience, he thought that what he was doing was still in service to God. So this is what he communicates to them. My effort in my whole life has been to serve God, even though it was in the wrong way at one point in his life. And at this, the high priest Ananias ordered those standing near Paul to strike him on the mouth. So they didn't like that at all. And this Ananias character is, well, Gardner gives us a little bit of info on him. Ananias became high priest in AD 47 and held the office for 11 or 12 years. His reputation for corruption is reported by Josephus, a description which makes his careless disregard of the law in Paul's case very credible. As a judge, Ananias was charged with maintaining fair treatment of those who were being heard. Now he himself was breaking the law by calling for the punishment of a defendant who had not been convicted of any offense. This was surely a violation of Jewish law. Jesus had suffered the same injustice when he stood trial before the same body in Jerusalem. So, another parallel there. But he does punish him in this way without being convicted of anything. He punishes Paul by having him struck on the mouth. And Paul obviously is not just going to take this line down. And he says, and then Paul said to him, God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. I like the inflection you put on that, Don, when you read that. That was good. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So this is very similar. Do you guys remember somewhere else in the New Testament where this kind of language is brought up, or this sort of accusation?
Get behind me? No, the other one.
Or I guess who says it?
Pharisees. Jesus.
Yep. Yeah, Jesus said it to the Pharisees, right? Calling them whitewashed
Tombs.
Right, whitewashed tombs. It's the same idea here that it just meant hypocrisy that they're portraying this very righteous outward appearance and just for show more so, and then their heart was truly corrupt, and that's what Paul is saying here as well, that you're not actually a righteous judge as you should be, especially as the religious judge of this people. God will strike you, you whitewashed wall. You sit there to judge me according to the law, yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So the you sit there to judge me, in the Greek the you is emphasized, so it's like, you sit there to judge me? It's saying that it is completely inappropriate that he is in that position because he is unfit for it. Yet you yourself violate the law by commanding that I be struck. So it's complete hypocrisy what's going on. Those who are standing near Paul said, verse 4, you dare to insult God's high priest? Paul replied, brothers, I did not realize that he was the high priest, for it is written, do not speak evil about the ruler of your people. I'm not sure if you guys have heard some different interpretations about what was going on there in Paul's response. Maybe you've heard that Paul was kind of speaking sarcastically, like, oh, I didn't realize this was your high priest because of the way he's acting, kind of deal, where he's saying, like, you know, it's just pointing out once again that how incredulous he was that this was actually the high priest. Or if something along the lines of Paul was actually offering up some sort of apology at his rash outburst in response to being struck. As I was reading some of the commentaries, there were a few who said one thing and a few who said the other, but those are kind of the more dominant ones, where it was like, some said it was an actual apology, and some said that he was just speaking sarcastically, kind of pointing out that the high priest was not a righteous person and not worthy of that position at all. So, not quite sure what the best reading is there, but there are a few interpretations of that. And then we see something kind of interesting. Then Paul, knowing that some of them were Sadducees and the others Pharisees, called out in the Sanhedrin, my brothers, I am a Pharisee, the son of a Pharisee. I stand on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead. Okay, so what does it seem like Paul is doing here?
Being a bit divisive.
Divisive, yeah, and turning them against each other, right? Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely. Follow-up question, is what he is doing, is that deceitful?
No.
Intentionally lying?
It's not deceitful.
No, it could be considered.
But I guess what constitutes deceit? Some sort of...
Did he take advantage of the situation? Yes.
Yeah, he did. But do you think that he lied in what he said, I guess, to get this reaction?
No.
Ultimately, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just gonna say, if you know that half the people in the group would stand behind your philosophy, you would, try to get them to agree with what you're saying.
Yeah.
And stand up for you.
Yeah, but he didn't tell them his whole philosophy. If he mentioned Jesus, I don't think they would have stood behind him.
They
Yeah.
knew what he was about, though.
Yeah.
I mean, that wasn't a secret.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that, I think you guys are certainly on the right track, if not got it fully, that there is some strategic language used here, and that he certainly seems to try to be positioning them against each other, as he knew that there was already a lot of tension in the Sanhedrin between the Sadducees and the Pharisees because of their differing views and ideologies. And so he was kind of playing into that, but he also does tell the truth. I mean, he's not being intentionally deceitful where he is a Pharisee, and this is something that he makes mention of plenty throughout the New Testament and in his epistles. And then he stands on trial because of my hope in the resurrection of the dead, which, I mean, it's true because of what he is speaking about, specifically in his hope of resurrection, which would have been in Jesus, which, I mean, that is something that he's been consistently preaching up to this point. And
But didn't Jesus himself say, to be meek as sheep,
Wise
shrewd
as
as wolves?
Wise as serpents,
as a
gentle
serpent,
as a
innocent
dove.
as doves.
Although I like lessons from
Right.
So he's being shrewd here. Let's face it, he's trying to save his bacon.
He's trying to save his bacon a little bit, yeah. Yeah, but it is interesting. Jesus kind of does something similar to this to escape a situation in John chapter 10 with quoting Psalm 92, I think he does. Might want to fact check me on that. Yeah, so it is very strategic. Oh man, we're already on the third fill in the blank. Oh my gosh. Yeah, well anyways, this is just what he does. I mean, it just kind of shows more about how masterful he is with speaking and language and intelligent he is, I suppose. So number 2, I didn't even talk about that. Whoops. Man. Well, it'll pop up a few more times, so we'll just roll with it. So number 2, the similarities between Jesus' story and Paul's. The similarities between Jesus' story and Paul's were shown. Whoops. You can cross out that was and say were. It's incorrect grammatically. Shown by Luke once again as he continued with Paul's narrative. Similarities between Jesus' story and Paul's were shown by Luke once again as he continued with Paul's narrative. I guess we did mention it, sort of, but yeah, it is a very similar situation, especially in regards to how he was struck before the Sanhedrin. And then Paul spoke, number 3, fill in the blanks, Paul spoke strategically while also keeping his integrity intact. Keeping intact his integrity. I'm second guessing myself. Paul spoke strategically while also keeping his integrity intact. He sure does. And then Luke gives his Gentile and potentially plural Gentile readers some insight on why it was significant that Paul said this. In verse 7 he continues, when he said this, a dispute broke out between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. The Sadducees say that there is no resurrection and that there are neither angels nor spirits, but the Pharisees acknowledge them all. So he's just given some context to his Gentile readers about what's going on and why the fight broke out as it did, the disputes and disagreements. And so there was verse 9, there was a great uproar, and some of the teachers of the law who were Pharisees stood up and argued vigorously. We find nothing wrong with this man. And they said, what if a spirit or an angel has spoken to him? So potentially, some of the commentators think that potentially there was maybe some sympathy for Paul's position just because of himself being a Pharisee and having some of the same beliefs as them, and so they thought that it could be potentially or possible. And then furthermore, how they do side with him to some degree, not fully, but they side with him to some degree just because of what he has said about the resurrection, and they didn't want to back down from that, saying that there's, the resurrection is false or anything like that. Because that's not what they believed. And obviously, like I said, there was already a lot of tension between the two groups. So this little fight breaks out. And so they're sympathizing with him a little bit there in verse 9, but it's not because, it's just using it for their own benefit. The dispute became so violent that the commander was afraid Paul would be torn to pieces by them. He ordered the troops to go down and take him away from them by force and bring him into the barracks. So it's clear that what's happened is not just verbal in nature, but it's become physical. And that's what the Greek language indicates as well. And you can almost envision how the Pharisees are like trying to save Paul from the Sadducees, and the Sadducees are trying to pull him away because they're convinced of his blasphemy and want to put him to death. And so there's this there's this discord as they're trying to pull Paul, and the commander sees that this is not going to end well if he lets it go on any further, and so he orders all the troops to go down and to rescue him again. And then in verse 11, so this is a pretty bleak situation, right? I mean, Paul is not out, he's not having a good time. This isn't a theme park for him. This is what he was prepared to receive as he was coming into Jerusalem, as we read before. But in the midst of it, I'm sure that this was more difficult than obviously anything I've ever experienced. But to be hated so much by your brethren, and have folks who genuinely want to kill you is for unjust reasons is incredibly bleak. So verse 11, the following night the Lord Jesus stood near Paul and said, "Take courage, as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." So, what is implied in this little meeting with Jesus and in his words to Paul here?
He's gonna get out of there alive.
Yep, yeah, right. You're referencing that last part there. You also must, or as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. Yep. Mm-hmm. I mean, I spoke about it in general terms, but, well, I guess in some specifics. But what's one other thing do you think that Paul was experiencing that would have been a discouragement to him? Or not experiencing that would have been a discouragement to him?
Where's everybody else?
Everybody is in who?
Other apostles.
Apostles, yeah.
He's not getting any support right now
Yeah,
that we know of.
right.
Sort of like Jesus was. I mean, everybody was there wanting to be with him, and then all of a sudden, nobody knows you.
Yeah. Yeah, and whether that's because of just his level of security that others weren't allowed to speak to him, I'm not sure. But either way, I think you're right, that this is, what he's experiencing here is a lack of Christian community. And that is something that we've seen from previous chapters was so crucial for Paul. That was something that he loved his family of God so much, and received so much encouragement and joy from his fellow brothers and sisters. And now we see him in this very dark situation, and so far there hasn't been anyone that he's been able to fellowship with. And so, yeah, absolutely. I mean, maybe that's the thing that's more on his mind than the thought of being put to death, is the lack of companionship with fellow believers. So I think that's what's implied in Jesus coming near him. Is usually people in the Bible, well, anytime in the Bible where something happens to somebody, or if, like in this case where Jesus came and said, "Take courage," it means that Paul was discouraged. It wouldn't have been like, "Nah, Jesus, I'm cool, like I'm good. You didn't need to come. I'm feeling all right." It means that the Lord saw the state that he was in and decided to come and provide him with some support and lift him up. And that's precisely what he does. And what's interesting, something I didn't know, but the words "take courage" are only spoken of by Jesus in the New Testament. So no one else says those words in the NT, but only Jesus. And so this is what he does to Paul. "Testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome." He encourages him without absolving him of future responsibility. And he's saying the work is not over, but you will live to see Rome, to make it to Rome. Now, that's the fourth fill in the blank there.
Don't you feel like it's saying, you're gonna go to the highest in the land and speak before them?
Yeah, well, this, right, yeah. They were going to Rome,
And he's going to Caesar.
right? Right, yep. Yeah, so he's certainly going to have a platform. Yeah, absolutely, Kathy. So number 4 there, sorry, is in the midst of discouragement brought on by the threat of danger. And the lack of Christian community. Jesus appeared to Paul. In the midst of discouragement brought on by the threat of danger and the lack of Christian community, Jesus appeared to Paul. Crucial timing there. Verse 12, the next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. Oh, great. Wonderful. I guess we hadn't read this section. Does anybody want to read this, verse 12 through 22?
I'll read it.
Jerry? Thank you, sir.
The next morning, the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. They went to the chief priests and elders and said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petitioned the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We are ready to kill him before he gets here." But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, "Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him." So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, "Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you." The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and asked, "What is it you want to tell me?" He said, "The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about him. Don't give it to them because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They have taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They are ready now, waiting for your consent to do their request." The commander dismissed this young man and cautioned him, "Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me."
Thank you. Right, so this is the follow-up of Paul before the Sanhedrin. So the next morning the Jews formed a conspiracy and bound themselves with an oath not to eat or drink until they had killed Paul. More than 40 men were involved in this plot. Let me make sure, please. So this is bad. And what we think of here, or at least what I thought of when I was first reading this, that they weren't, how they had bound themselves to an oath and they weren't going to eat or drink anything. It seemed to me that urgency was the primary concern, just because they were like, we're not going to do these things until we kill Paul, so it's like we got to do it quickly so we can go back to surviving, I guess. But what some of the scholars informed me was that more so here was the intense focus on the matter. And it was like, the idea was that we're neglecting these essential earthly things so that our primary focus, our only thought night and day is Paul's death, the murder of Paul. That's the kind of intensity and the aggression that they're bringing to the table, and that's what these 40 men, which is a lot. That's like a lot of trained assassins to do this. This is a pretty sizable force for this attack. Of course, they didn't know what resistance they would come up against, but there's a lot of folks there who are doing that, and that's number 5 in the fill in the blanks. The large group of assassins made Paul's murder the priority of their lives. A large group of assassins made Paul's murder the priority of their lives.
How many S's are in assassins?
What's that?
Thank you.
How many S's are in assassins?
ASSINS.
Okay.
That's one that I always had trouble with too. I'm like, just throw a few in there. Everybody knows what you mean. Yeah, that's it though. 5 total. So there was this plot, and then we'll just kind of work through this section 14 through 22 as it just tells this story. They went to the chief priest and elder, said, "We have taken a solemn oath not to eat anything until we have killed Paul. Now then, you and the Sanhedrin petition the commander to bring him before you on the pretext of wanting more accurate information about his case. We're ready to kill him before he gets there." So it's obviously an intelligent way to do this, because they want to know more information about Paul. They know this is true, and so they're putting this all under the guise of that idea of wanting to know more information, which is pretty convincing. And they're coming to people who are also want Paul dead, so they're obviously on the same side about this. And then verse 16, "But when the son of Paul's sister heard of this plot, he went into the barracks and told Paul. Then Paul called one of the centurions and said, 'Take this young man to the commander. He has something to tell him.' So he took him to the commander. The centurion said, 'Paul, the prisoner, sent for me and asked me to bring this young man to you because he has something to tell you.' The commander took the young man by the hand, drew him aside, and said, 'What is it? What do you want to tell me?' He said, 'The Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul before the Sanhedrin tomorrow on the pretext of wanting to know more accurate information about him. Don't give in to them, because more than 40 of them are waiting in ambush for him. They've taken an oath not to eat or drink until they have killed him. They're ready now, waiting for your consent to their request.' The commander dismissed the young man and cautioned him, 'Don't tell anyone that you have reported this to me.' So obviously secrecy was of utmost importance if this was going to, or if they were going to be able to safely transport Paul to Rome. And so this is where he tells the young man not to do this. And so we see a little bit of information about Paul's family life that we don't see really anywhere else. When he has a sister, and this nephew of his is come to his physical salvation in this way, that he is telling the commander about this plot. Well, he tells Paul, who tells him to tell the centurion, tells the commander, and he is Jesus' words about him that he must also testify in Rome are going to come true because of this.
Does it not bother you though that the chief priests and the elders, the main people of the church, would let murder be done?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's clear. It's clear from their actions, but that is a very shocking thing, and I think intentionally so, that these Jewish religious leaders who are supposed to be the ones who are the best examples of what a law-abiding Jew would look like. They were ones who are supposed to be able to teach very adequately on the law, that they themselves, and especially in this regard, we see that they completely threw all that out the window, and just for doing something that they wanted to do, and to kill Paul.
Just saying that with Jesus.
Right, yeah, yeah,
And
exactly.
When Stephen, I mean,
Yeah.
Yep. Mm-hmm,
that guy wasn't a trial.
No.
right, right.
But you got people that's in the armed forces part of that, that is gonna stand up and do what's right, even though they could be killed, doing it.
Mm-hmm,
They're gonna stand in there to try to protect this one man,
mm-hmm.
because they know what they're doing is wrong.
Yeah, and and the Romans know that this is such an important prisoner that they have to keep him safe. If all these Jews want him dead so passionately, I mean, they weren't just doing this for anybody. They wouldn't send out 40, or these 40 assassins wouldn't come together for just anyone. This was a serious matter, and the commander knew that he had somebody on his hands that it was very important that he get him to Caesar.
How many of this 40 do you think started that?
I don't know, but they didn't, well, yeah, they're not going to succeed, so. I'm not sure. It's an interesting question. So, what comes next is kind of interesting. I'll just read this part. Verse 23, well, we'll just work through this here. How about that? Then he called 2 of his centurions and ordered them, get ready a detachment of 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to go to Caesarea at 9 tonight. This is a large group of soldiers here. These 470 that are charged with protecting Paul on his way to Caesarea. And at 9 tonight, this was a time, it was 35 miles this trip was going to be, and to leave at 9 in the evening was a time when that never would have been done. I mean, that was a huge no-no. Like, do not travel overnight like that. But this is what they think they have to do in order to keep him safe from these assassins. And so this is precisely what they do. Provide mounts, verse 24, for Paul, so that he may be taken safely to Governor Felix. So, Governor Felix, Gardner gives us a little information about him as well, which is helpful, some of this historical context, as soon as I can find it. What? Maybe it was not Gardner. Maybe it was Rice. It was somebody. What verse is this? 24. Okay. At Rome, in the household of Antonia, the mother of the Emperor Claudius, there were 2 brothers who were first slaves and who then became freedmen, named Antonius Felix and Paulus. When Claudius became emperor, Paulus was one of his favorite companions and advisors, and it was through his influence that Felix obtained the position as governor of Judea. There he governed as one who thought, in reliance on his brother's power and influence with the emperor, he could commit any crime with impunity. Tacitus, who tells us these facts, describes him as one who wielded the power of a king in the mind of a slave. Suetonius, another historian, tells us he married 3 different queens through the course of the years. His first wife was named Drusilla and was the granddaughter of Antony and Cleopatra. Suetonius does not name his second wife but calls her a princess. His third wife was also named Drusilla, but she was the daughter of Herod Agrippa I and therefore sister of Agrippa II. So he goes on to talk about his marriage life a little bit more and some of his family stuff. But Felix is a bad guy, not a cool person. In other words, that he was had this aggressive mind and that he could just commit crimes without having any punishment for them. So that he may be taken to Governor Felix. So he wrote a letter as follows: Claudius Lysias, To His Excellency Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews, and they were about to kill him, but I came with my troops and rescued him, for I had learned that he is a Roman citizen. I wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin. I found that the accusation had to do with questions about the law, but there was no charge against him that deserved death or imprisonment. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So we see this political letter. This is the only time in the New Testament that we see this. But Luke gives us this letter, this insight into this political transcribing between these two people as he was sending them this. And so, what does Claudius Lysias do here in that verse 27, as a good politician does?
Puts a little spin on it.
Right, yeah. So, particularly, he rearranges the order of things, right? He claims that he rescued him because he knew that he was a Roman citizen, instead of finding that out well after the fact. So he reorders that, the events chronologically, and paints himself in a good light in that way. And so he wanted to know why they were accusing him, so I brought him to their Sanhedrin and found the accusations had to do with the question about their law. There was no charge against them that deserved death or imprisonment, so once again, he's not quite sure what exactly their deal is. When I was informed of a plot to be carried out against the man, I sent him to you at once. I also ordered his accusers to present to you their case against him. So they're still trying to figure out, what is Paul guilty of, deserving of death, even according to their law? Don't know. That's fill in the blank 6 there from verse 27. Claudius Lysias lied about the order of events in order to put himself in a more positive light. So he lied about the order of events in order to put himself in a more positive light. So Reese says this, which is kind of interesting. Lysias has listened to Paul's speech from the stairs and his defense before the Sanhedrin. So he's already heard him speak. Out of these, he has been able to discern 2 things. It was a typical Jewish dispute, and the prisoner has done nothing Rome is interested in. Lysias would have been able to list several points of disagreement that were, to his mind, Jewish. They are: A, the prisoner was accused of breaking the rules of the temple; B, the prisoner affirmed and the Jews denied that a teacher named Jesus had risen from the dead; C, the prisoner affirmed and the Jews denied that the teacher was entitled to the name Messiah. So those are the things he would have been able to communicate. So verse 31, the soldiers carrying out their orders took Paul with them during the night and brought him as far as Antipatris. The next day, they let the cavalry go on with him while they returned to the barracks. So they probably would have returned just in case any other mobs or things broke out at the time. But there was also a total of 1,000 soldiers in Jerusalem. So 500 would have been left behind, or almost more than 500 would have been left behind as they went on to take Paul to safety. But they went back just in case they needed more support. When the cavalry arrived in Caesarea, they delivered the letter to the governor and handed Paul over to him. The governor read the letter and asked what province he was from. Learning that he was from Cilicia, he said, "I will hear your case when your accusers get here." Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard in Herod's palace. Okay, so about Cilicia, there's one more thing to read. Sorry, I know it's a lot of reading tonight, but I thought these things, little nuggets, were helpful. Things that I didn't know. I really should have underlined what I was supposed to be reading in here before all this. I cannot for the life of me remember what it was. Okay, yeah, so Felix asked this question in reference to saying, and when he had heard it, he asked him from what province he was. Felix asked this question to learn what his own duties were in the case. Did he have to consult the ruler of another province before trying Paul, or did he just have jurisdiction already in the case? It was the same procedure as when a prisoner is taken today. Those holding him may not have geographical jurisdiction over him. Felix asked the question to learn if he properly belonged to his jurisdiction. Cilicia, it was in the same presidency as Judea and Phoenicia. Namely, all were parts of the Roman province of Syria, and therefore Felix did have jurisdiction in Paul's case. So that's why he's saying he had to ask just in case if he wasn't supposed to be the one presiding over things, but he was, just learning that he was from Cilicia. So he said, I will hear your case when your accusers get here. Then he ordered that Paul be kept under guard at Herod's palace. And the palace was the Greek word for praetorium, was somewhat, that's the Greek word, was somewhat elastic in its application. It could speak of a palace where a king lived, or it could mean a barracks where soldiers lived. It came to signify any building where an imperial representative lived. And the building here spoken of was probably built by Herod the Great for use as a royal residence, and which had now been appropriated by the Romans. So that's the location that they were going to. So just a little bit of historical context, not anything incredibly pertinent for application, but interesting things to be thinking about as we're going into the next chapter. So this is kind of where we leave Paul for the moment, and he is, we saw very discouraged, just as the result of being hated and tried to be killed. I mean, I'm sure he was still recovering physically from when they were beating him to death. And then just from the lack of companionship from his fellow believers. And so the Lord appeared to him and encouraged him in the most significant time of need that he had. And then there was another plot to kill him, although he was on his way to meet before Caesar. And that's what will happen in a little while. Any other thoughts on the passage that we read today? Any questions or things you guys are thinking about as we're reading it?
You know, as you read that passage, you wonder, is God trying to teach Paul a lesson here, or is he trying to teach the people a lesson? You know, because this is some pretty stiff stuff, and you know,
Yeah.
they don't normally think about those things. It just goes on, and all of a sudden now he's bringing up all the details of what their jobs were.
Mm-hmm.
And likewise, Paul, this isn't the only time he's going to encounter trouble.
Mm-hmm.
And so Paul has to be prepared with an answer.
Yeah.
And so it's an interesting conflict taking place there.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it does seem, just from the chapters that we've already studied so far, that the Holy Spirit was warning him all the way that this is what awaits you, essentially. That trouble is going to await you, and you're going to experience hardship, and he does, certainly. And so, yeah, you're right. I can't imagine the situation that he's in, where he still has to carry out his mission. I mean, he still has his duties before him, but he's not like had a good night's rest and had some flapjacks in the morning that he's feeling energized and things like that. He's pretty worse for wear and still has this like I said, this duty, this mission.
But do you think, I mean, look how many other lives are being touched
Mhm.
by him. All these men
Oh, yeah.
are in these armed forces. Are they not wondering, who is this man?
Yeah,
Why are we doing this, you know?
yeah.
I mean, God's using it all the way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Which, Kathy, I think that's a great point of application for us, where we might think like, if we're in a season of life, not to over spiritualize this or apply Paul's situation directly to us, but if we're in a season of life where there's great struggles and things like that, and we've been faithful, you know, we haven't been like foolish with our money or something like that to deserve the things that we're getting, or foolish with our relationships. Like, you know, we've been for the most part acting faithfully, and we find ourselves in really tough positions in life. We also still have the duty to reflect the light of Christ in our relationships with people in this world around us, and kind of the reality for us as believers. And this is something obviously Jesus recognized, which is why he told us to count the cost, is to be consistent in the times of plenty and in the times of want in our conduct. And that's precisely what Paul does, as he continues to spread the gospel, shine the light of Jesus, and tell others of the hope of the resurrection. And considering his body not worth much, but clinging to that hope himself. It's a good thing for us to think about imitating in our own lives, yeah. Yeah, thanks for pointing that out. All right. Ron, would you mind praying for us?
Heavenly Father, I thank you for this time that we've had to fellowship together and to learn more of your word. I pray, Father, that you would help us to apply your word to our lives and to be able to live as Paul was able to live through this persecution. I pray that you strengthen each one of us, guide and direct us, and bring us back again. I pray in Christ's name, amen.
Amen.